back to religion in the Ozarks. We've got more good stuff to talk about. Before we do, though, let's meet another one of our famous Ozark people and learn another Ozark vocabulary word. We're still in March Madness here, so you know we got another round ball. This time it's a guy. And I should point out that none of the people pictured in our March Madness edition actually played in March Madness. These are all kind of pre the madness of the NCAA tournament. But this guy was a great college player, and I would be absolutely shocked if anybody knows who this is. He's not as famous as the Redheads.
Can you give us a time frame?
This picture is probably from the 40s. Probably from the 40s. I'll just go ahead and tell you who this one is. His name was Gordon Carpenter. Gordon Carpenter, nicknamed Shorty, as all tall people were back in those days. Just kind of a rule, you know. And if you were real short, you were Stretch or something like that. But Gordon Carpenter, he was from Ash Flat, Arkansas, which is not too far from where I grew up in Arkansas. And as you can see, there was a star for the University of Arkansas and was an U.S. Olympic player. And if he had lived 10 years later, he almost certainly would have been a player in the early years of the NBA, but the NBA really didn't get rolling until the 1950s when he was past his prime. And so he played professional basketball, but it was in the pre-NBA days. In those days, you've heard of the AAU. Today we think of the AAU as it's the Amateur Athletic Union. It's something that high school kids play in the summertime, in the spring after the high school season's over. But back in those days, the AAU was a network of like corporate teams. Sometimes college teams would be in this. In the early days of organized basketball, companies would have their own basketball teams. If you can tell the jersey there, it says Phillips 66. And in those days, Phillips 66 had one of the great powerhouse basketball teams in the AAU, and they would play other corporate teams, and they would have these annual tournaments and you know, crown champions of the leagues and stuff like that. And the way that these corporate teams worked is that the corporations would actually hire these basketball players and would put them on the payroll, but the main thing that they did was play basketball. And then usually if you kept your nose clean and you know you stayed loyal to the company, when you got past your prime and you couldn't really be an effective basketball player anymore, you'd usually take some kind of job with the corporation. And so that happened with a lot of teams. And a lot of these were out west, like Phillips 66. But Gordon Carpenter was one of the great pre-NBA players.
How tall was he?
Hey, I've seen anything from 6'5" to 6'7", so I don't really know exactly how to. So he was certainly in those days. He would have been he was a post player in those days. Today you got 6'7" point guards sometimes, but he was a big guy in those days. And this is true. I interviewed just a few years ago. I interviewed his high school basketball coach. His high school basketball coach is still living down in Arkansas. He's way up in his 90s. He's probably about 95 years old today. He's basically the same age as Gordon Carpenter. I think there may be like 1 year difference. And his high school coach is this little bitty guy who was probably about 5'5", who was a college basketball player. And right out of high school, right out of college, he was like 20 years old when he graduated college. He got this job coaching this high school team at Ash Flat, Arkansas. and the team won the state championship. You know where Ash Flat is. You're right there next to it in Cherokee Village. And but in 1939, led by Gordon Carpenter, Ash Flat won the big school state championship of Arkansas, even though it's a town of at that time, of 200 people. But back in those days, you could choose which division you wanted to play in. And there were only two divisions. There was the big school and the small school division, and Ash Flat said, hey, we're the best, so let's just play in the big school division. And they actually won the state tournament. That was the only year this little guy coached a high school basketball. And what are you going to do after that? You win a state tournament your first year? What he did was retired and went to med school. That's here we go. And so he became a doctor. And really neat story, though. Of course, it was mainly due to Shorty Carpenter, that they won the tournament. Yeah. No, it was so long ago. If they ever had a sign up on the edge of town, it rotted down years ago. And there are probably most people in Ash Flat today wouldn't know who Gordon Carpenter is if you met. He never moved back there. He always, he was a basically a professional basketball player and worked for Phillips 66. And I think he lived most of his life in Colorado, so he never came back. But yeah. Well, it's not that bad. They've got a Walmart now, so. One of my favorite words, stob. Butch is almost, he's computing. He's almost got this one.
Is this a verb?
Verb.
Stop somebody.
It can be a verb or a noun. It can be either one, and you're right there, sort of on. I don't know that you would say to stob somebody, but you're not far off. Have you seen Sling Blade? Carl on Sling Blade, the Billy Bob Thornton character, uses the term stob. It's the only time I've ever seen in a movie a character say stob on screen. And actually, in the way that we're meaning it here. It can be a short stick or piece of wood, or it can be the, as you can see there at the bottom, you can use it in either way. Or it can be you can pick up a stob. That's how it's used on Sling Blade. Carl walks up to the little boy and says, "What are you doing with that stob?" He's got a stick and he's beating the ground with it or something like that. Or it's usually a stob refers to like after you bush hog a field. And if you know what bush hogging is, you leave stobs. They're these cut off about that high, and they're kind of sharp sticks sticking up where the bush hog has whacked them off, and that's a stob. Something you don't want to fall on, or you don't want to drive on, as Eugene is warned. He'll stob a tar. Yeah. Of course. In the rural Ozarks, you put tires on your car, right? And your tractor. You don't mess with tires. They're tars. Yeah. So that's what that is. Yeah. You can stob a tar on a stob. It's a multi-purpose word. You got to remember that one. That's basic. That's basic Ozark vocabulary right there. Yeah. If you don't know a stob, then that'll expose you as a poser, faster than anything will in the Ozarks. Some folk traditions, but we'll talk about a few of these, whether they're brush arbor revivals, protracted meetings, that kind of stuff. These are things that in some places in the rural Ozarks are still part of the fabric of society, maybe not to the level that they once were, but are still important social events and religious events in the Ozarks. We'll look at some of the background to these. We talked about camp meetings and heard an account of an early camp meeting. And as I mentioned, By the time you get to the early 20th century, these are usually referred to simply as brush arbors or brush arbor revivals, like the one we saw in the Shannon County home film. And by the early 20th century, different religious denominations could hold brush arbor revivals, but they were often associated with Pentecostals by the early 1900s, or what some people refer to as shouting Baptists. There were some groups that were Baptists that got pretty happy at their revivals as well, and people often referred to them as shouting Baptists. As a matter of fact, I read this story recently, or not really a story, just a short account of this around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900. There were these two women in a community who had been kind of fussing with each other, and one woman decided she found the perfect way to get the other woman. She was going to go to a revival that the Shouting Baptists were holding down the road, and she was going to get the Spirit. She decided she was going to get the Spirit during the revival and beat up the other woman while she was under the Spirit. And that way, nobody would notice. It'd just be kind of part of the general commotion, and she would really wail into this other woman. But somebody tipped the other woman off, and she didn't go to the Shouting Baptist meeting. But I guess you could get away with something like that. That'd be a way to kind of blend in. You wouldn't necessarily notice if someone was beating you up on purpose. Maybe it was the Lord doing that to you. But that's a Shouting Baptist story. And here's another story. This is from around 1900, early 1900s. This is a woman in northwest Arkansas. She's actually writing this years later, remembering back to her childhood. And she writes, talking about some of these shouting kind of Pentecostal type meetings that they would have at their local church. She says, new preachers would come to hold revivals, and there were several old ladies who shouted, and you better get out of their reach if you didn't want to get a pounding. So, you could see where maybe this wasn't beyond the realm of possibility that someone would decide the perfect cover for beating up my enemy is to go to one of these shouting meetings and pound the daylights out of her. And this woman writes, one night a bunch of us ran outside. While they shouted and screamed, the dogs would wake up and bark at them. And so it was her memories of going to one of these churches that got the Spirit quite a bit. And you can find a lot of these accounts of people stirring the dogs up with their shouting, or angering the neighbors when their meetings would go late into the night, and even with loud music and stuff.
You got that pounding word up there.
Yeah, that's something different.
Folk tradition?
That's okay. Let's skip down to poundings. Who knows? In this context, it's not I'm gonna pound you at a shouting meeting. This is a different kind of pounding. Has anyone ever heard of what it means when you pound the preacher? Not, I'm going to get this guy. Let me punch him between the eyes. Has anybody ever been in a church where you pounded the preacher? Nobody knows what pounding the preacher is?
That you're giving him kind of a choir or something?
Sort of. It's actually giving. Usually, this is done when you get a new preacher who moves in, and it's basically giving housewarming gifts to the new preacher. It's called pounding the preacher. At least what I've read, the term comes from the practice of giving a pound of something to the preacher. Nowadays, you might take a pot of beans over, or a cake or something like that. It's almost always food of some sort. But when you get the new preacher come in, you pound the preacher. And I can remember as a kid, hearing about people pounding their preachers on the. I think the church I grew up in even did that, maybe once or twice, pounded the preacher. So that's what that is. What do you call it? Just giving stuff to the preacher? Just a kind of, just welcome to the new pastor kind of thing. Yeah, it's again in some rural areas you probably could still hear it referred to as a pounding, but I don't think that's probably part of the Catholic tradition, or the word is probably not part of the Catholic tradition. Yeah, pounding, but yeah, that's what. So we've talked about two different kinds of religious poundings here tonight.
Where is Violet Hill?
That's actually my hometown in Arkansas. That someone that's in north central Arkansas. Someone sent me that picture. I have no idea who the people in it are.
There is a town called Violet Hill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's the river?
That I'm not sure what they're in. There's no stream that big at Violet Hill, so I'm guessing they're not. It wouldn't be. It could be a pond. More than a lot. It's probably the Strawberry River. I'm guessing, which is a few miles from there. I'm guessing that's what it is. Just a little. It's just a little river. It's a tributary of Black River, which starts in southeast Missouri and goes down into northeast Arkansas. But I'm guessing that's what it is. And again, I don't know who these people are, but they're from the little Baptist church that I grew up in. And someone sent me that. Someone from Oklahoma, whose ancestors lived there, sent me that picture. So I put that up there, and they put they identified it. So I don't know how to get that off. But it's very possible, it's probable that this baptism that's taking place here happened shortly after what was called a protracted meeting. And the Baptists often use this term in the rural Ozarks, having a protracted meeting. It was basically what we would call a revival today. Sometimes they refer to as meeting of days. But they were all basically the same thing. As time goes on, and as the revivals move indoors, away from the camp meetings, and they move them inside church houses, they take on a little different form and take on different names, but they serve very much the same function. The revivals or the protracted meetings are usually held in the late summer during the lay-in-by period, and they're the time of year in a Baptist church or in a country Methodist church or in a lot of these churches, when it's expected that a lot of the young people will be converted, that they'll come forward to the mourner's bench, or to pray at the front of the church to the altar, and that they'll be saved right there on the spot. And that's usually these baptisms with lots of people participating in them would take place after one of these protracted meetings, when there were lots, especially young people, who had gone forward and made a confession and decided to join the church. So I'm expecting that's probably what that is. And you can see most of them are girls or young women who are, it looks like they're all wearing coats. So I'm not sure. Maybe it's, it could have been late summer, early fall in there. There are leaves, there are leaves on, but, and so this would have been a pretty typical scene for a river baptism for, the 19th century Ozarks, well into the 20th century Ozarks. These were often community events as well. People would come from far and wide to go to these things. They didn't have them just every day. And back in those days, churches didn't have baptistries or any facilities for doing indoor baptisms. And that's where you did them. Did them out in a stream, wash your sins away, and let them. That's why you want to be in, and that's why you want to be in running water. So that that's part of the idea. So they, your sins are washed away. This is a group of Baptists, of course. Members of the Church of Christ also practiced full immersion, and some groups like the Methodists and Presbyterians often sprinkled. Practiced a different kind of baptism that didn't require this, a river or a creek of some sort to dunk somebody under.
Did they take a collection at these meetings?
Yeah.
And what happened to
Well,
them? Who got the money?
the preacher. Yeah, that it was typical in the 19th century Ozarks in rural churches. Generally, there was no set salary for a preacher because usually what they did was they hired a new preacher every year, or sometimes they would keep a preacher on for a second year. But in the rural Ozarks, preachers were almost never full-time preachers, with the exception of some of those circuit riding Methodists. If you were a Baptist preacher, more than likely you were a farmer or a blacksmith or something like that, and you preach on Sundays. And the church would take up a little offering for the preacher on whatever day they had church. And it may be 75 cents, or, it may, depending on what time of year it was, it may be produce, 2 pounds of bacon, chicken. It could be just about anything. It wasn't going to be much. And most rural churches in the Ozarks didn't have full-time pastors until the middle of the 20th century, or even past World War II. It was just not really a feasible thing to do. So yeah, that was practiced going way back. Yeah, and then the thing in the middle, Decoration Day. Who knows what Decoration Day is? I think McNeil talks about Decoration Day, doesn't he?
That's when you decorate the gates.
Right. It's named for decorating graves.
Isn't it like the old name, like Memorial Day or something like that?
It's depending on the community. Some communities practice Decoration Day and some communities practice Memorial Day. Nowadays, since Memorial Day is an official holiday, Memorial Day has often taken the place and kind of crowded out Decoration Day, but it is an old term for Memorial Day, and this was common throughout the rural Ozarks, rural America, small town America in general. It's the day when you come together, and not only do you decorate the graves, but you have to remember too that in most of these rural cemeteries, they don't have the money to hire somebody to take care of these things. And Decoration Day was also the day when people came together and fixed up the cemetery. You pick up the limbs, trash, all that you kind of just clean up the place. It's not just decorating, but it's cleaning up the cemetery as well. In the days before you could, pay some teenager to come and mow it half a dozen times during the summer. So that's part of the process as well. After the Civil War, this becomes also caught up in remembering the veterans, especially decorating the graves of, if you're in a pro-Southern area, of the Confederate veterans, or Southwest Missouri, decorating the graves of the Union veterans. And so that becomes all part of it as well. And of course today, our official holiday, Memorial Day, that's what that is about. It's more of a Veterans Memorial Day than just a general remembering all the people who've passed away sort of day. But these are all folk traditions that were practiced, and in some places still are practiced in the Ozarks. The little church that I grew up in still has Decoration Day every fourth Sunday in May, or whenever it is, right around Memorial Day. But they call it Decoration Day, and a lot of places still do that. Any questions about some of the folk traditions before we move on? All right. And then there are those unusual stories that you get everywhere, and the Ozarks has got a number of those, just to mention a couple of them. And I don't think they're there anymore, Sean, so you probably can't find them in Taney County nowadays. But there was a short-lived religious/nudist colony or nudist group down in Taney County in the early 1900s who had a kind of a commune on Bull Creek. Not exactly sure where in Taney County Bull Creek is, but it's some tributary of White River, I'm sure. And the story is, and I've only seen this in one place, and there's not many details in this, but there was a guy who grew up in Taney County who wrote his memoirs. They were published in the 60s or 70s, and he talked about remembering when this group of about 20 nudists tried to parade nude through downtown Forsyth, and they were arrested. And this was, he didn't remember the exact year, but he said it was around 1910, and that the Bull Creek nudists came to Forsyth. So, we think nothing exciting ever happened back in those days, but certainly on at least one day in Taney County it did. And there are lots of these odd little stories, and another one of these from the Arkansas Ozarks was a millennial group, one of these millennialist groups. That's a term we use to refer to groups who are predicting the end of time, that the end of time is near and Jesus is coming back, that kind of thing. This was a group that called themselves the Incoming Kingdom Missionary Unit. Not the best name, probably. It looks like they could have come up with something a little more poetic than the Incoming Kingdom Missionary Unit. But this was a group that started around the time of World War I in Illinois. A couple of brothers who were ministers in the Christian church, in the Disciples of Christ church, decided that they had figured out, especially one of them, John Battenfield, decided that he had figured out when the end of the world would take place. And he had figured out, I think the original date was going to be 1973. Or 1966, somewhere around in that era. And he decided, now this was again around World War I, but he was also a virulently anti-Catholic, and he was convinced that the Antichrist from Revelation in the New Testament was going to come out of the Catholic Church, maybe be the Pope. If you get on the internet and look in the right places, you'll find the same exact stuff in 2013 about Pope Francis, that he's the Antichrist or something like that. There's still some wackos out there who are talking about that. But he decided that there was going to be, in the 1920s, that there was going to be this worldwide battle between Catholics and Protestants. And that the Protestants were going to win. He was Protestant, so they were going to win. But that the Catholic Church and the Vatican would fall in like 1926 or somewhere, sometime in the 1920s, and then it would just be a matter of waiting until the end of time. And so Battenfield wrote a couple of books, started this newspaper called the Kingdom Harbinger, in which they were talking about the end of times. This was just the latest in a whole line of groups who had talked about the end of days and all that kind of stuff. And they eventually decided that their leaders or their followers needed to move to the mountains and set up these kind of communes in the mountains and kind of get ready for this battle between Protestants and Catholics. And this particular group set up at least 3 communes that we know of, and one of them was in the Ozarks, in this little town called Gilbert, Arkansas. It's still there today. You can drive. It's just off of Highway 65, down south of Harrison, a little ways down in there. And so a bunch of them moved to Gilbert, Arkansas, and set up this little colony of their group, and they raise their own food and start making stuff and all that kind of stuff. And after they had been there a few years and the colony had grown somewhat, the thing that brings an end to it is not the fact that the forecast war between Protestants and Catholics never materialized. As far as I know, it never materialized in the 1920s, unless you talk about the election of 1928, when Catholic Al Smith was demonized for being pro-liquor and all that kind of stuff. But Battenfield, one of the colony members, died in the mid-20s, like 1925 or so, and he said that before this person died, he had tried to heal them, and he couldn't heal them. After the person died, he said, "I will raise this person from the dead." And that obviously didn't go the way he expected it to go. The person didn't come back to life, and it pretty much ruined his reputation, and he sort of snuck off and left the colony. And the colony pretty much gradually fell apart after that. Some of the people stayed, and there are descendants of some of these colony people who still live in that area today. Not all of them left.
Something in the water down there? Isn't that the area where we have the militants there in Harrison?
Yeah, it's a little farther south. Yeah, this group, there is, you might say there's something in the Ozarks, the image of the Ozarks, that I think has tended to attract groups like this. Part of it is the remoteness of the Ozarks. That's part of what they were attracted to. They wanted to go back to somewhere in the highlands where they could kind of do their own thing. And although in the 1920s, Gilbert wasn't nearly as remote as it is today, because there was a railroad that went through there. Today, about the only people who visit Gilbert are people who float the Buffalo River. It's on the Buffalo, and but yeah, there have been lots of other groups all the way into the 21st century, as Millie mentions, the various white supremacist groups who live in the same general area, though up closer to the Missouri line today, and all of them tend to have some sort of religious component. Even the white supremacist groups tend to be fundamentalist Christians of some sort, and tend to see themselves kind of first and foremost as Christians, and secondly as white supremacists. Yeah, but to them it's all kind of wrapped together. You can't really unravel the mystery that is the racist God. That they have. And so I think, there's been something to the Ozarks that has attracted those kinds of people over the years. And there's other groups that we could talk about, the harmonial vegetarians of the pre-Civil War days of Northwest Arkansas, and which was a commune. And of course, we've still got a handful of kind of leftovers of the early 70s hippie communes in the Ozarks. There's East Wind, which is down in between Gainesville and West Plains, in that area. That's an old commune that there are, or at least a few years ago, there were a few nudists down there. National Geographic did a story on East Wind, and there were a handful of nudists there. And there's probably another commune or two tucked away somewhere in the Ozarks where people are doing whatever you do at communes. I think just a lot of it is because the Ozarks still has large stretches of remote country. It's the same reason Montana attracts the Unabomber and the various people that end up out there. It's just cheap land, backwoods, lax law enforcement in a lot of places, and you do what you want to do. And people, generally in the rural Ozarks, people leave you alone because everybody's up to something. You let me do my thing and you do yours, and we'll call a truce here.
I think Ozarkians are very individualistic, and they don't they don't mean that in a mean way or anything like that. They just
Yeah.
kind of who they are.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Yeah. Maybe it's one of those characteristics that probably gets kind of sanded off over time. You know, the way society has changed over the last 50 years, you know, with bigger government, and we tend to depend on the government more. But I think there's still a large streak of individualism in lots of Ozarks people, and a lot of the people who have the biggest, widest streaks are the ones who didn't grow up here, but they moved here because of that. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of that. I came here to be left alone, and you know, you pound somebody else. I don't want your cake, sort of thing. You know, no housewarming for me, neighbor. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah, and that's very much what the rural, what a lot of the rural Ozarks is like. Yeah, I know where I live. It's that spirit is very much alive, because I live in one of those places where almost all the natives left, and you got new people who've moved in, and I think a lot of them they're in the Ozarks because they want to be left alone. You know, they don't necessarily want to come down and join the PTA and be neighborly, you know, that kind of thing. So. And some of us natives want to be left alone too, so we're perfectly willing to go along with it. All right. Now, there have been religious people in the Ozarks, movements in the Ozarks, who didn't want to be left alone and wouldn't leave people alone. They're called missionaries. And we've had both religious missionaries, and we talked about John Mason Peck, one of the earliest missionaries in the Ozarks, a Baptist missionary. And we've also had educational missionaries. There was a whole movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s to establish what were called mission schools in different places in the Ozarks. So we've had that little element in Ozarks history. But we know that there were lots of missionaries, some of them as circuit riders, some of them just regular religious missionaries in the early days of the Ozarks. That's one of the reasons that churches caught on, and a lot of the early churches in the Ozarks were founded by missionaries who were paid by missionary societies back east to come and bring the church and bring civilization to the frontier, just as they had done in Tennessee and Kentucky earlier, and Illinois and Indiana and places like that. You know, that spreading frontier, and we get our missionaries here in the Ozarks. The mission schools were a little different. This is after the region had already been settled. Just as the religious missionaries, the preachers, were attracted to the Ozarks in the early days because of the absence of churches, the educational missionaries were often attracted to the Ozarks because of the absence or perceived absence of schools. And most of the major Protestant denominations in the United States sent mission teachers to the Ozarks at some point, either in the late 1800s or early 1900s, to set up these mission schools. They were sometimes called mountain mission schools, even though, as we know, the Ozarks, technically not mountains, but they were often referred to as mountain mission schools. And there were several of these spread around the Ozarks. We know some of them in southwest Missouri. Does anybody know what the most famous mountain mission school was? It's still in existence today in a different form, just down the highway from us, Highway 65. Yeah, College of the Ozarks was founded in the early 1900s. It was originally called the School of the Ozarks, and it was a mission school operated by Presbyterians, the regular, not Cumberland Presbyterians, but the regular Presbyterians. And it was a good example of a religious denomination going into a remote area that had where the children had very little access to education, or at least a high quality education, and setting up a school. And the school served both to teach children, to civilize them, as many of the people who operated these mission schools were convinced that all the Ozarkers were uncivilized hillbillies. So to civilize them and to bring religion to them. This is an age when there was a lot of competition between denominations, and the Presbyterians, they weren't above getting into the game and trying to convert people to their side. The Methodists, Baptists, they were all doing the same thing. And all of these groups eventually get involved in setting up these mission schools. For a while, Southwest Baptist College, or Southwest Baptist University now in Bolivar, was officially considered a mission college by the Southern Baptist Church, although it wasn't founded like that. But there were a few years in the early 1900s when it received funds earmarked for mission schools because it was in the Ozarks. Most of the mission schools in the Ozarks, though, were in Arkansas. There were a bunch of them that were founded down there. Many of them were founded by Baptists, by Southern Baptists. There were Methodist, there were Presbyterian mission schools. There were a couple of Episcopalian mission schools founded in the Arkansas Ozarks. And most of them, I can't think of any that have actually survived in the way that the College of the Ozarks has survived in a different sense. One of the mission schools in the Missouri Ozarks was this one. I think the building when I took this picture was abandoned, and I'm not even sure if it's still there or not today. That was a few years ago. It was called Iberia Academy. Does anybody know where Iberia is? We talked about Iberia earlier in the semester. It's in Miller County, up in the northern part of the Ozarks, south of Lake of the Ozarks, that area. And Iberia Academy was sponsored by the Congregational Church. And the young man and woman who set that up came from Illinois. They were recent college graduates from Illinois in the late 1800s, came to Iberia, started this school, and it operated for many years up until about the World War II era. Drury is a congregational school. It was founded by Congregationalists. Drury wasn't considered a mission school, but they had a connection with Iberia Academy, and a lot of the graduates of Iberia Academy would come to Drury because it was a Congregationalist college, and that connection existed. But again, there were at one time about a couple dozen of these mission schools scattered around the Ozarks. Again, most of them in North Arkansas, but these were all denominational. They all were doing as I said, they were trying to civilize the population to a certain extent, educate them, and bring them into their religious fold, whatever that happened to be. And most of the major Protestant denominations got involved in this movement at some point in the late 1800s or the early 1900s. In addition to the mission schools, many of the denominations set up what were called mission stations or medical missions. The Presbyterian Church was especially active in doing this. They had one of these so-called mission stations does anybody know where Climax Springs is? It's on the south side of Lake of the Ozarks, not too far from the south edge of the lake. I think there's still a little school there today, Climax Springs. It's up there, the edge of the Ozarks. The Presbyterian Church for several years had what they called a mission station where they built a little church, and they had a school, and they even did like medical missionary work and different things like that. So there was a lot of these efforts to bring things to the rural Ozarks that people didn't already have. My wife's hometown down in Arkansas, the Presbyterians had is a little town today of about 500 people, smaller than that in the 1920s, as you can imagine. And the Presbyterians set up one of these stations there. And they built a little clinic. They called it the hospital. It was basically the size of a house. And because the house is still there and somebody lives in it as a house today. But it was the first hospital or medical clinic built in the entire county. And the Presbyterians built it there and they helped fund the school and different things like that. So it was another way that religion and religious groups had an impact, especially on the rural Ozarks, through these medical and mission stations and mission schools and that kind of stuff. One of the more interesting mission schools that I've ever come across is down in North Arkansas in the White River Valley down there. And it was operated for several years by Mennonites. And they had come to, this was around the World War II era, and they had helped set up this little school in a very remote place in the White River Valley of Arkansas, and ran this school, and eventually were able to kind of build up the Mennonite community. These were not old order Mennonites. These weren't horse and buggy Mennonites. They were more modern Mennonites. And in that same area, it was the Mennonite church that established the first hospital and sort of, helped, I guess you could say, bring civilization or at least modernization to the area. And sounds kind of strange to say the Mennonites are bringing modernization to you, but these are not old order Mennonites. But some of it speaks to how remote this area of the Ozarks was, where they came to, where it's the Mennonites who bring you the modern world all of a sudden. So you're sort of behind, I guess, if that's going on. But and of course, today when we think of Mennonites and the Old Order Amish and Old Order Mennonites, we have lots of them in the Ozarks today, and this is a new phenomenon. And by new, I'm talking about it's something that has happened within the last 50 years. We see these Amish communities, and of course, I guess the closest one is out in Webster County, the Seymour area, out Diggins and Seymour, that area, just off of 60. But there are some up around Buffalo, and they're really spread all over the place now. And they've even crept down into Arkansas as well. But you see their homes and their farms and communities, and because of the way they live, the horse and buggy and all that kind of stuff, it seems like they've been there forever. But these are relative newcomers to the Ozarks. A lot of these people have come within the last 20 years to the Ozarks, have come from the places like Ohio and Indiana, where you have larger, more traditional old order communities. And as they procreate and they look for places to kind of spread out and farm new land, they come to places where the land is somewhat affordable and at least somewhat fertile. And Webster County was a pretty good place for that. Springfield Plain, pretty decent land. When they started moving in there in the 60s and 70s, it was affordable land. And of course, they have their own religious beliefs too. That's what motivates their lifestyle and their communities and that kind of stuff is their religious beliefs.
Are they Amish or Mennonites? Is it a mixture of both?
It could be both. I think most of them are Amish, but you have old order Amish, you have old order Mennonites in the United States, and there are many little subgroups of them. I mean, they're worse than the Baptists to split up and form their own little splinter groups over just everything. And there was a study done in the mid-'70s. Somebody may have, did anybody review the book Immigrants in the Ozarks? Okay. It was on the, I think it was on the list, the book review list. But this, he was a geography professor here at Missouri State, Southwest Missouri State back then, who did a study of the. At that time, this was a new phenomenon when he was looking at them in the early and mid 70s, and even then, when they were not nearly as plentiful as they are now, he found numerous little subgroups where there would be like 12 families who belonged to this group, and 6 families in this group, and 8 families in this, and they were always really small little groups who had what we would consider minute religious differences or lifestyle differences, but to them they were, important differences, and kept them separate, one group from another. And I'm sure now there are probably even more of those little groupings now that it's been almost 40 years since he studied those early Amish settlers in the Ozarks.
That was one of my favorite parts of traveling up here from West Plains. I was like always hoping I'd see Amish.
Yeah. And you usually do. If the weather's decent and you're not traveling at night, you almost always see at least one buggy. I drove through there this morning, and it's 30 degrees outside, and you got the 3 little kids bundled up in the back, in the back of the buggy, and looking out, at the world. You just wonder what they think. It's such a strange thing because you see these people, and I think most of us see them, and we sort of don't think of them as living in the 21st century because in so many ways they don't. You see these like 25-year-old women who've got 3 children already, and they just seem like 19th century women to us. Yeah, and you think about it. I mean, they're a resource for craft traditions that most of us have lost. Several years ago, if you remember, back earlier in the semester, I showed a picture of the 2-story log house called the Wolf House in Norfolk, Arkansas. It's where the North Fork of the White River flows into the White River, and this house was built in the 1820s. And they got this big grant to refurbish the house and kind of fix it up. It was falling apart a little bit. And they brought in Amish carpenters to work on the house because they were the ones who knew how to use these methods and had the same tools and stuff that the people who built the house in the 1820s would have been using. And they were very skilled workers and knew how to do everything. The children are fascinated. My daughter called them. Little House on the Prairie girls. Yeah, that's what we went to. As I mentioned, some of them have moved into North Arkansas, and where our farm is in North Arkansas, there's a sale barn nearby that specializes in like sheep and goats and stuff like that. And I took the kids to. We don't have sheep and goats; we've got cattle, but I took them to this sale barn once, and almost everyone in there was Mennonite or Amish or something. I mean, they were dressed like that, and the little girls had the prairie dresses on and the bonnets and stuff like that, and my daughter, just got the biggest kick out of the Little House on the Prairie girls in there. We do have a few what you might call Ozarks originals, religious denominations that are or were headquartered in the Ozarks or had their beginnings in the Ozarks. In the case of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, if you remember when we talked about some of the early German immigration to the region, we talked about the old so-called Saxon Lutheran colony of Perry County, Missouri. Again, that area where the locals say we're not in the Ozarks, even though physically they're in the region of the Ozarks. But the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church had its beginnings there in that community and is one of the largest Lutheran bodies in the United States today. It's also a conservative Lutheran denomination. The Assemblies of God, of course, is headquartered here in Springfield. It's the largest Pentecostal organization in the world, I believe. The Assemblies of God is. It was founded in just before World War I. It was actually founded down in Arkansas, but very soon they moved their headquarters here to Springfield. And of course, we know there are lots and lots and lots of Assembly of God churches in the Ozarks, especially here in southwest Missouri, but you find them everywhere. And these are Pentecostal churches. All the Assemblies of God are on the Pentecostal spectrum, would be more, I guess you would call them more of your modernized, maybe less conservative Pentecostals. And I'm using that term in relatively, relative to some other Pentecostal groups. It wouldn't, they're certainly less conservative than the Pentecostal Church of God, which up until a couple of years ago was headquartered in Joplin, Missouri, but that is no longer an Ozarks headquartered denomination. They've actually moved since I first taught this class, which was just a couple of years ago. They moved to Texas last year, I believe it was. They didn't leave because of the tornado. They had actually decided to leave Joplin before the tornado, and God just reinforced their decision, I guess, when that happened. And that may be how they looked at it. I wouldn't, I don't know. But this was a conservative, much smaller denomination than the Assemblies of God, and they are no longer headquartered in the Ozarks, though there are still some of their churches in the Ozarks, the Pentecostal Church of God. And then also headquartered here in Springfield is the Baptist Bible Fellowship International. It's a conservative fundamentalist Baptist denomination that had one very famous member. No, not Ashcroft. I think John Ashcroft is Assembly of God, I think. Yeah, Evangel. That's Evangel University is the Assemblies of God college. Yeah.
Isn't there a Baptist Bible College in Springfield?
It is affiliated with the Baptist Bible Fellowship International, and Jerry Falwell was their most famous alum. And
Northtown.
yeah, it's up on Kearney or somewhere in there. I don't know the exact corner. It's on, north part of town. Yeah, and but Jerry Falwell went to college there in the 50s when they started the college, and of course he became one of the best known preachers in America for many years. And he died just a few years ago. Hadn't been too long ago. Falwell is probably best remembered for founding what was called the Moral Majority back in the 70s, and helping infuse politics with conservative Christian values, which is a major issue today now, more than 30 years after the Moral Majority was founded. So he certainly left his stamp on the American political scene and the American religious scene. But that is again, a fundamentalist Baptist group that's still headquartered here in the Ozarks. And it's a small, I mean, it's nowhere near as large as the Southern Baptist Convention or there are lots of other Baptist groups that are larger, but because of Falwell, they probably had a greater influence than their numbers would suggest. These are a couple of the sites from Missouri Synod Lutheran country over in Perry County. That's the old Saxon Lutheran Memorial, the old log building underneath that. And Frona is a small town over there, and Altenburg is as well. And I think this is the last thing on there. It's easy to paint with too broad a brush. I mean, we've talked about this in here before. The Ozarks is not as diverse as a lot of places in the Ozarks, but it's still there's a lot of places in the United States, but it's still a pretty diverse place. And you can find even here in Springfield, you can find almost any religious movement you're looking for. There are Buddhist monks here in Springfield, and almost anything that's out there is in the Ozarks, is in Springfield now. But if you had to come up with some general characteristics to characterize the religious, atmosphere in the Ozarks, you might say that in general, churches and people tend to be evangelical, and that just refers to, in this case, Protestants who focus on that sort of rebirth experience, born again Christian sort of experience, emotional conversion kind of thing, which encompasses tens of thousands of Christians in the Ozarks and certainly millions around the United States. Fundamentalism is a pretty strong force. Evangelicals and fundamentalists aren't the same. I mean, there are differences, and we won't go into detail in here. The old line was that a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's mad about something. That's oversimplifying it, but there is a certain militancy to a fundamentalist. You can be an evangelical and not be a fundamentalist. If you're a fundamentalist, you're certainly an evangelical, just with a little more on top of that. When we think of fundamentalists, we sometimes think of people who are sectarian, who are maybe a little hardcore, a little more hardcore about what they believe in, and convinced that you're wrong if you don't agree with them, more so. But fundamentalism is alive and well in the region, and because of the tradition we have here with the Assemblies of God and the Pentecostal tradition, charismatic religion is important in the Ozarks, and you don't have to be Pentecostal to be charismatic. There are charismatic movements in all kinds of churches, but generally we use the term charismatic in religion when we're talking about, especially people who speak in tongues, church services that get more emotional than your service if you're Presbyterian, that kind of thing. But you have a lot of charismatic religion in the Ozarks. And the last thing I'll mention is that especially in small towns in the rural Ozarks, you have lots and lots of independent churches and churches that are members of very small denominations, but you will find lots of independent churches out there. Maybe going back to what Millie said about Ozarkers having that independent streak, and you find a lot of churches that just don't belong to anything. We're our own church. Sometimes one of the odder ones I saw, this was in Ash Flat, Gordon Carpenter's hometown. There was this church, I don't know if it's still in business or not, but there was this church, it was in so-and-so independent church, and then in small letters under the big sign it said Baptist Doctrine. So, I mean, they were clear that they were an independent church, but they were Baptists, but they were independent. So they were doing, they were kind of straddling the fence there. And that's probably an old Baptist trait too. We're independent to a fault, and if that means dividing the congregation every 10 years and starting a new church, that's what happens, right? And so you find a lot of these independent congregations of various kinds. Some of them are very fundamentalist, maybe charismatic, Pentecostal type churches, and some of them may be somewhere on the other end of the spectrum. Today one of the trends is in suburbs and more affluent areas to have these big independent churches that don't belong to any denomination, and where you have lots of. Is that what James River is? No, that's Assembly of God. You talking about the one down toward Ozark and on the left? Yeah, that's an Assembly of God church, and yeah, the Assemblies of God have I've noticed in the last few years they build a lot of churches without the name Assembly of God in it, or sometimes it'll just say so-and-so assembly, you know, and I don't know, it's just kind of, seems to be a trend in there. But yeah, that one does have a connection.
You've heard of Cowboy Church?
Cowboy churches,
So, well, we have them here.
Yeah.
Stockyards.
right, there are, that's a phenomenon that has really caught on in the last 10 years or so, I guess across the United States. Certainly, I've seen a lot of them in the Ozarks, a lot of the cowboy churches.
They've grown, I guess.
Yeah,
They've got quite a
yeah.
large congregation.
Yeah.
They bought land to build.
Yeah, and I'm not sure doctrinally what the cowboy churches stand for. I think they're pretty conservative, but I don't know if they're sort of like Baptists or, with cowboy hats, or I don't really know what they do. I know there are some out in rural areas, there are cowboy churches where part of the fun is you ride your horse to church. That sort of thing. So,
This group has actually bought land on Double E,
yeah.
built a church,
Yeah.
a building of their own.
They're building them out there so they can ride their horses around church, I guess. If you're going to be a cowboy church, you might as well go all the way. And of course, I don't know if I were a preacher at a cowboy church, if you got guys out there with holsters and stuff, and I may watch what I'm saying. You may not step on toes as much, challenge your parishioners as much as you otherwise would. But and this is I took that picture. That's actually in Sharp County, Arkansas. I don't know if that place is open anymore, but I just like the picture.
What does all of that say?
It's the Greater Faith Holiness House of Prayer. And you can see the fire up there, which generally anytime you got fire on a church sign, that's an indication that it's a Pentecostal church of some sort, fire baptized, Pentecostal church, and this is just a little kind of like a more permanent brush arbor building is what that is behind there, and there was like a little stage up there with a pulpit and benches and stuff like that. But I don't know if they're still. It didn't look like they were in business, even when I took that picture several years ago. So they may not be anymore. But I did like the sign, Greater Faith Holiness House of Prayer. So, and you can see Wednesday night, Friday night, Saturday morning, and Saturday night. No Sunday services. So, a little unusual there, but you find that sometimes with charismatic groups. They don't meet traditional nights or days, that sort of thing. All right, any questions about religion in the Ozarks before we call it a topic and move on to something else?